Welcome to the StoryADay podcast. This is Julie Duffy from StoryADay.org, encouraging you to be a writer every day, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Julie from StoryADay here. And today I have a treat on the StoryADay podcast because I have a guest for you celebrating the release of her new novel, The Spare Man. I have science fiction and fantasy writer Mary Robinette Kowal. Mary Robinette is the author of The Spare Man, The Glamorous Histories, Ghost Talkers, and The Lady Astronaut universe. She's part of the award-winning podcast Writing Excuses and has received the Outstanding Award for Best New Writer, 4 Hugo Awards, the Nebula and Locus Awards, and her stories appear in Asimov's, Uncanny, and several years' best anthologies. Mary Robinette, a professional puppeteer, also performs as a voice actor, recording fiction for authors including Seanan McGuire, Cory Doctorow, and John Scalzi. She lives in Nashville with her husband Rob and over a dozen manual typewriters. And you can find out more by going to maryrobinettekowal.com, the link to which and several other things will be in the show notes. Welcome, Mary Robinette.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And so many reasons I wanted to ask you here. Obviously, you're one of those writers who writes short stories, but also writes novels. But the main reason I wanted to invite you here right now is that you have a new novel out.
I do.
And you've been touring and doing some visits to bookstores and things for that. How's that?
It's been delightful. I had been warned before I went out that the rooms, that audiences there would be fewer people and all of that. And what I found when I got out there was that people are really hungry to see authors showing up again. So, and even the people who were like, no, I didn't feel comfortable coming in person, they were still excited that the author was going to be there. So, but it was nice to see people. It was really nice.
Let me tell people a little bit about the new book. The new book is called The Spare Man. And the blurb is Tesla Crane, a brilliant inventor and heiress, is on her honeymoon on an interplanetary space liner cruising between the moon and Mars. She's traveling incognito and reveling in her anonymity. Then someone is murdered, and the festering chowderheads who run security have the audacity to arrest her spouse. Armed with banter, martinis, and her small service dog, Tesla is determined to solve the crime so that the newlyweds can get back to canoodling and keep the real killer from striking again. Who could resist?
I hope no one. I could listen to you say festering chowderheads all day, honestly.
Well, we can clip that for you and you can use it Perfect. As a ringtone. So this book, you've written in various areas. You've got your historical, fantasy-ish stories and the Lady Astronaut series, which is more sort of hard sci-fi and alt history, very digestible hard sci-fi. And now you have this sort of glamorous noir space romp. What's going on?
So I tend to think of genre as kind of 2 big camps. You have your aesthetically driven genres and your structure driven genre. And so a structure driven genre is something like a thriller, romance. There's a defined structure. There are beats you have to hit. Science fiction and fantasy doesn't have a set structure. We are driven by aesthetic, by that sense of wonder, by the look at this world, isn't it neat? And so once I kind of realized that, I tend to approach science fiction and fantasy as set dressing, and then and like set dressing that I'm excited about, to be very clear. But it does mean that switching from one to the other is just about swapping out aesthetics, not about learning anything new structurally.
You always have kind of, obviously there's always suspense pulling people through your stories, but this one is an out and out mystery. Did it feel different? Was it harder?
It did and it didn't. So Ghost Talkers, which conveniently I happen to have here, Ghost Talkers it's a military book, but it's also a murder mystery as well. So I had flirted with the form before, and this time diving in, I think some of the things that felt different about it was were more related to being a little bit more mature as a writer. When I was starting off, the thing that was hardest for me was structure. And I always felt like I could back into a short story that was like a good short story, and I didn't know how I got there. So that was the thing that I had worked on hardest, and then was like very carefully plotting and everything. And oddly, with The Spare Man, I had my big tent posts. I knew kind of the overall arc that I wanted, but I decided to free write most of the first half of the book and follow the Agatha Christie model of like giving everybody motive and opportunity and then figuring it out later. I had big tent posts. I kind of split the difference on that, and I definitely wound up going back and like reverse engineering an outline, but the mystery part of it, that did not feel sufficiently different to be surprising. Oh, and also, a thing that I haven't talked about at all in any of the conversations that I've been having about this book, the first novel that I wrote intentionally after I am going to write a novel, not counting like the novel Zero in high school or the accidental novel that I wrote for my niece and nephew. But the first intentional one was a science fiction murder mystery.
Ah.
So this is getting back to my roots.
Oh, lovely. So let's talk about some of the characters that you have in this book. Obviously, we've mentioned Tesla, who's the rich inventor genius who's just got married to Shal, who is a wonderfully rounded character, and Fantine, the spectacular lawyer, who I want to ask you about. But there's a feature in the way you wrote this book, which is pretty unusual, and I think it reminded me a lot of like one of the things I loved about the original Star Trek is how aspirational it was. We have a mixed crew, racially, gender-wise, and it was telling stories of the world the way we wanted it to be. And I feel like there's something that you're doing in this novel that's a bit like that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The pronouns.
Pronouns.
Yeah. So I do feel like the job of science fiction is not to kind of predict the future, but to show a map of possible futures. And so I try to extrapolate from where I am and look forward. And looking forward, I think that a reasonable place for us to head, and some place that I would like to see us head, is a world where gender is something that, your gender expression is what you choose for it to be. And the dictates of society are significantly lessened. So what I decided to do was that people who have grown up there and then just default to they, and then do not assign any, male, female, Z, zer, don't assign any of that until the person identifies it for themselves. And that it also becomes just part of being polite, that you let people know so that they don't have to, you're not putting them in a position where they have to make guesses. You're not putting them in a position where they might expose themselves to being wrong. You just tell them, and everybody tells each other. And it's all just like, this is just how we say things.
Yeah, because it was very noticeable at the beginning of the book that as people they're on a cruise, they're meeting people for the first time, they introduce each other, and it's this, I would say, I'm Julie Duffy, she, her, and it's just something everybody does. So it's a little like, I haven't seen that in a book before. So as a reader, it's a little, jarring's not the right word, but it's noticeable. How do you, as a writer, balance? Well, how do you get bold enough to stick with your convictions in something like that, where you're breaking conventions?
So I'm basing it on a real convention, which is when you go, for instance, to a science fiction or fantasy convention, the panelists will often introduce themselves, and it's becoming pretty much the norm now that when you introduce yourself on the panel, you're like, hello, my name is Mary Robinette Kowal, she, her, I am a writer of, and a lot of icebreakers. It's like, hello, let's introduce ourselves to the class. So, please name, gender, something about where you're from, and or name, pronouns, excuse me. And so it seemed like a logical extension to me that would bleed over into just the way people are in in their social life as well, especially after Zoom, where it's helpfully written right below our name. So in terms of being bold enough, it's just, again, it's an extension of something that I'm seeing happen in the real world. The other piece of it is that I worked with a sensitivity or a cultural consultant for this because I am a 53-year-old woman who grew up with, being programmed with gender as a binary, and I knew that I was going to make a lot of mistakes. And that is more of the, like, how do you, when you're thinking about doing something that is outside your comfort level, getting help. Like that's basically what I did. And there were a ton of things in the book that Christine Sandquist was my reader, and they flagged stuff that I was like, oh yeah, wow, did not notice that I did that very, very gendered expression for this character that I in a world where it's supposed to be gender neutral is the default, I have made gendering decisions about everybody. It's like, oh yeah,
we don't see the things that are ingrained. And I'm happy to say the StoryADay community is very sensitive and lovely and tends to be quite concerned about getting stuff like this right. But then because they're lovely and sensitive, they tend to worry a little bit about getting things wrong.
Yeah.
So like just asking for help is your advice there?
So asking for help, but also reframing it in your brain, because when you are approaching something as, I don't want to get things wrong, you're approaching it from a place of fear. And in many ways, you wind up othering the people that you are trying to represent, because you turn them into people that you're afraid of, with the focus on, I don't want to get it wrong. So what I counsel instead is to think about the things that you absolutely want to get right, and also looking for the places of joy.
It brings us back to your book beautifully, because there is so much. I mean, there's murder, but there's also so much fun in this book. Yeah, and I want to ask you about that. A lot of people that I talk to, they worry about not being interesting enough to be able to tell interesting stories, which is, I don't worry about. I tell them not to worry about it, but it's hard. But your books tend to include things like, happy, well-established romantic relationships and people who have hobbies and pets and things like that. And yet, they're not boring. So why isn't it all doom and gloom with you?
Yeah, I'm writing the books I want to read, and I'm just I want something fun. So there's a couple of things there. One is that with the couples, I treat my relationships, the relationship itself, as a character, which, so basically, when you're writing a story with a character, if they have a character arc, the character themselves is, oh, I have angst and what am I doing with my life? So those are the stories in which the couples break up, they get back together, they break up, they get back together. Or you have a character who's going on an adventure, and the adventure is going to put stresses on that character, but the character never doubts themselves. And you see this like Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes does not suffer a great deal of existential dread on the page. Clearly he does, but he's not going through an arc. So what I do is, the relationship is not struggling with but are we a relationship? It's like, yeah, we are a relationship, and we will feel some stress and trauma, which we will express in different ways as the external events affect us. But I focus much more on that than I do on the internal. It's like how each aspect of the character react, and they react differently. And that can be a cause of stress, but they're never in doubt. So I still get to have arguments, but they are adults and they use their words to resolve them. And then the pets, I have to tell you, pets are like one of the single most useful plot devices. I introduced I think the first time I had a character with a pet was Relentless Moon, and now I'm like, they're always they just always need to be in the thing, because if you have someone having a line of questioning and you need to interrupt that questioning, just have the dog be a dog.
And there is an adorable dog in this, but not just a pet dog. This dog is a working dog.
But Gimlet is based on three real dogs. There is an actual dog named Gimlet who is a Westie, owned by Eileen Cook, who's a phenomenal writer. And Gimlet is deeply adorable dog. So all of Gimlet's "Hello, I'm a Westie" off-duty personality comes directly from that dog. Then my mom has a service dog, Captain, who's a stability dog, but he's where I get the "go say hi" as a command. So service dogs have commands. They have specific behaviors that they're trained to do. And "go say hi" is particularly useful for my mom because with Parkinson's, once Captain gets her to wherever she needs to be sitting, he doesn't have another job to do since he's a stability dog, but she doesn't like people looking at her. So being able to say "go say hi" and have Captain know he can go there and then come back as part of his job means that people pay attention to him and they aren't looking at her. So I took that. And then the third dog comes from my subject matter expert on PTSD service dogs, Jordan Corella. And Jordan has a PTSD dog and who's a delight and very, very good dog. And so those are the three dogs that kind of combined to become Gimlet.
So there's some of the what you know, but also the research, right? Because you have an expert, and you're writing about spaceships, which you just casually drop into conversation. Things like I call that my astronaut friend. How should people? How'd you get started with that? People are. Well, one of the things I really like about the Spare Man is that you have this big traveling cruise ship, and there are different levels and different gravity comes into it. There's it's not the same as it would be for us, and that plays into the story. So you've obviously done a lot of research on this.
Yes. So I had done a fair bit of research onto centrifugal generated gravity for the Lady Astronaut books, and I had rocketry consultants for that. So I had this idea of the ship that I wanted to build, which is bonkers ship. It is completely bonkers ship. And then I talked to Max Fagan, who's an actual rocket engineer. He's currently working on the orbital reef for a Blue Origin, which is, giant floating space, it's a new space station that they're working on. And he made a spreadsheet that is so ridiculously detailed. So I know exactly how big the Lindgren is. I know the speed that it's traveling at. I have all of these things. All I did was just ask. And the way I got hooked into this community in the first place was that I asked on Twitter. It's does anyone know anyone who, at the time who's either a woman pilot or preferably an astronaut or in air and space in any way, because I have some very specific questions. And the science fiction fantasy community is really great, and people will be like, I know someone, and will reshare. I have a platform which is helpful, but I have found that if I message someone and say, even before I had a platform, I could write to someone and say, hello, I see that you have this specialty and I would like to, I usually offer to hire them. I have a couple of very specific questions. Would you be willing to answer these questions for me? An example of a question is, and I have three others, or, I have some others and may have some follow-ups. And people are really generally very happy to talk about it. I've had one person say no, and one person say no and then reconsider when I did my a slightly more detailed explanation. And the occasional people who just don't respond, but no one's been nasty about it.
That's really great to hear, because I know people are usually, they're tentative about it, but I think I can't imagine too many people who wouldn't respond positively to somebody saying, you're fascinating, tell me about what you do.
Well, and if you've done your research, usually you're coming to them with something that is not easily researchable, or you are coming to them with one of the reasons that Max is had so much fun with designing the Lindgren is that he does, he's got this whole degree and he's designing rockets, but He doesn't get to do anything practical with centrifugal force. And so he got to talk about like these angles, like exactly what angle each of those levels needed to be at, to talk about the diameters. He got to do all of this stuff that's fun for him. He went into the field because it's a field he loved. And I'm getting to say, do you want to do something outside the box? And also the other thing that I've been told by more than one person is it's like that they do not have an opportunity to talk about what they do with people who are not people that they work with.
Right. Who know all this stuff, right? So you don't get
Right.
to have the really interesting conversations.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something for people who are interested. Mary Robinette does a feature on her for her Patreon backers, interviewing experts, where you get to listen in to some of these interviews, and you get two things out of it. You get fascinating conversations, and you get to hear how someone who's been doing this for a while actually interviews experts. So that's a fascinating feature that you share with people.
It is a lot of fun. And you just reminded me that there's an HVAC person that I talked to when I was working on the calculating one of the Lady Astronaut books, and I need to bring him back in because I have different Mars questions.
Okay, make a note. We'll wait.
Yep.
All right, so switching tacks slightly, you are one of the people who seems to still have maintained a love for short stories, even though you're writing longer stuff as well. It's something that people are often told to do as a stepping stone to becoming a novelist. I have some thoughts on that. Do you have any thoughts on that? And should people be writing both?
Yes.
And
yes,
why do some people find it difficult?
Yes. And so doing it as a stepping stone is unnecessary. Jim C. Hines did a wonderful survey several years ago about debut novelists. And it turned out that it was the 50-50 split on people who wrote short stories first and people who went straight to novels. So it does not actually make a career difference. However, I think that writing short, if you want to have a career as a novelist, also having short stories as a skill is very useful, because at some point in your career, someone will say, can we have this story for this anthology? And knowing how to do it, super useful. It's also very useful for exploring ideas before you dive into a full novel. Shades of Milk and Honey was actually originally a short story. Ghost Talkers springs out of two different short stories that I did with that character. It's the Lady Astronaut universe starts with short stories set in the universe where I explored things. Spareman doesn't. That's a break. But it's a good way to be able to kind of play around and get a sense of, oh, this is the thing I'd like to do next, or experiment with a genre that you haven't played with before. Again, when we're talking about the mysteries, I wrote several short story mysteries before I dove into it in novel length.
And speaking, yes, of short stories, you said Spareman does not come from a short story, but I'm wondering, have you any plans to, maybe do some spin-offs? You have a wonderful character in this story called Fantine, who is our heroine's lawyer. And because of the time differences, because she's on a ship going away from Earth, she spends a lot of time waiting to hear, having this conversation, which is asynchronous, crocheting angrily and working on her swears. So I'm putting in a request for, like a spin-off with Fantine, and it might have to be a shorter story, but that's, obviously entirely up to you. But yeah, you had a lot of fun with Fantine, I'm thinking.
Yes. I had so much fun with her that she was in significantly more of the novel than she is in the final version. I had to pull her out because I'm like, no, this is too much Fantine. She is delightful, but she is not actually serving a function here. But
how did you would you like to give us a couple of examples of her creative cursing?
Festing chowderheads is mammering lobsters. They're not all seafood.
There's like something about St. Dimna's dad.
St. Dimna's dad. Jehoshaphat's swim trunks. Yeah, I actually put up on my website, I think, my top 10 favorite Fantine swears.
I'll link to this. It's in the feature, my favorite bit on Mary Robinette's website. So I'll link to that. But yes, I'm just, requesting more Fantine, basically.
I'll see if I can do something where if there's any plausible reason for Fantine to dog sit Gimlet. But
oh no, we haven't talked about the cocktails in this novel.
Oh yeah.
Every chapter has an associated cocktail.
Yes. So even if you don't read science fiction or fantasy, this can be your new bar book, because I think there's 40 some of them, and they're a mix of classic cocktails, zero proof cocktails for people who do not do the alcohol thing, and then some ones that I made up because I wanted things that had thematically appropriate names for that are somehow linked to the chapters. And there's a really shocking number of death-related cocktail titles already out there in the world.
So hard work doing that research, I imagine.
It was extremely challenging. I did feel like it was important for, for my brand of authenticity and accuracy to have tasted all of those if I were going to put them in the book. I didn't want to put anything in that I couldn't get behind.
We appreciate your sacrifice.
Thank you. I'm so grateful.
I hope you enjoyed the first part of our interview with Mary Robinette, but come back next week where we really dig into what it's like to be a working writer, and we get some tips on how to be a writer, or at least how Mary Robinette deals with being a writer in this busy world we live in, and also while dealing with some extra challenges which might seem familiar to some of you. So do make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast. A great conversation concluding next week. You can find out more at maryrobinettekowal.com. You can find her book, The Spare Man, wherever you like to find your books. And if they don't have it yet, you can request it. And you can join Mary Robinette's Patreon at patreon.com/Mary Robinette. It's not your average writer's Patreon. There's puppets. There's all kinds of good stuff happening over there. And I highly recommend you check it out. In the meantime, I hope you have a great creative week and keep writing.
Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at StoryADay.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week. And of course, keep writing.